Mr. Mohale, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
First of all, you've been attending the WEF conferences since the beginning for about 15 years now. Why is this conference important? Why should people care about what's being talked about here?
So the World Economic Forum, especially the Sub-Saharan chapter, which is now expanded, of course, to be the African chapter, is important, first and foremost, because it gets Africans talking. Because we know that man's greatest accomplishment is through talking, and yet man's greatest failures is through not talking. And maybe that's also the polarities with Africa. Sometimes we do too much talking and very little execution. And I think it was George Patton who said that great wars are won by great execution, not necessarily by good planning, because great execution will save even a mediocre plan. So when you think that Africa has been talking about a single monetary union long before the EU even conceptualized of the idea, today we have a currency called the euro. We have more than 20 countries that have come together, are now called the EU, and yet in Africa we still talk broadly about the 4 economic zones. So I think when we say this is the decade for Africa, Africans ought to be impatient and be looking for more execution and indeed delivery.
Of course, talking about that, the theme of this conference, delivering on Africa's promise, one of the key focuses of this conference is going to be on improving infrastructure on the continent to facilitate the accelerating economic growth and unlock trade, of course. You are the chairman of Shell, one of the big multinational companies in the world. What are your experiences? What are the impediments in terms of infrastructure for companies, big companies like you who want to do business in Africa and grow?
I think businesses find it easier to do business in those countries, and I'm talking about literally all over the world, where there's regulatory certainty, where democracy thrives, where there is good governance, where bribery, stealing and cheating is at its minimum, where those governments are focused, especially on the development of their people. So this is an area that is an area for development for Africa, because for many decades, Africa has been endowed with natural resources, mostly oil, gold, diamonds, platinum, etc. And yet the challenge has always been this does not necessarily percolate into the benefits for the majority of ordinary Africans. I think we suffer from the case of Brazil, where those countries that have the greatest amount of mineral resources, its people are the poorest. In exactly the same way that those countries that have refineries are the ones that run more often than not out of security of supply. So I think we need to be very innovative, we need to be very creative, but most importantly, I think we need to focus on 3, no more than 4 key things that we can do. Today, as I speak to you, it's very difficult for Africans to fly from west to east and vice versa, because we haven't seen it fit to create those pathways, because you create the pathways first and then business follows. So most of our airlines are waiting for business to happen first before they fly to a venue because they think it's profitable. I think we can learn from the Chinese. The Chinese have a age-old saying that simply translated and loosely translated says, if you build the road, the business comes. And if you want to be a millionaire, make somebody else a millionaire. I think these are some of the lessons that we can gather from Africa.
Of course, in closing, just briefly, your company Shell has got a big presence in Nigeria, and at the moment we see a very concerted effort between the leaders of South Africa and Nigeria to patch up the relationship, strengthen bilateral ties. Of course, these are 2 economic giants of the continent that are growing. How crucial is what we're seeing in terms of the South Africa-Nigeria relationship for businesses like yourself?
This is really momentous, because these are the 2 greatest economies in Africa, and it's manifestly in our interest that we ought to be working together, because when you work alone, it takes you inordinately long to accomplish anything that is meaningful. But when you pool your resources, you can really address the issues of inequality, of poverty, and indeed unemployment, the issues of infrastructure, and indeed of development of education, but also of economic growth. So I'm glad that we are now giving it our serious attention. We're talking about 170 million people in Nigeria. If you talk to Phuthuma Nhleko, the ex-group CEO of MTN, he will tell you that their biggest break was having a foothold in Nigeria that allowed them to be in most markets in the world. If you talk to Checkers, YT Bason, and you talk to now Pick n Pay and Woolworths, you'll find really some amazing, wonderful success stories. As Shell, we used to have a presence in 34 of the now 54 African countries, in both upstream, in midstream, which is gas and power, and indeed in downstream, starting from the refinery gate, oil, chemicals, aviation, marine, lubricants, and indeed our LPG business. So Africa is in dire need of energy, and some of this gas that is now preponderant in the continent of Africa. We see gas in Mozambique, we see gas in Namibia, we see crude in Nigeria, where Shell last year celebrated a wholesome 50 years of presence. That ought to be used for electricity generation, because we know that energy powers economic growth. When you do that, you create employment. When people are employed, you reduce poverty and indeed inequality.